I'd like now to transition to the third plenary session of the conference. This session will focus on skill development during the early years of children and youth and how it impacts their outcomes when they enter the workforce later in life. This topic is particularly and personally interesting to me because I've conducted research on this topic varying from the economic and educational outcomes of immigrant children, how much education they attain, and therefore how much their earnings they earn later in life, and how their employment situations turn out later in life. I've also looked at the impact that the Job Corps program has on training youth and young adults for a better workforce outcomes. So this is, for me, particularly interesting. We are honored to have such an accomplished research on this panel who will share their insights and their own research as well as the research of their own field. This is going to be a very interesting panel for you, so I think it's going to be one of the most interesting panels that I've definitely attended in my career. I'm going to hand things off to Bill Spriggs. Bill is going to be the moderator for our session, and he's going to provide some opening remarks and introduce the panel for us.
Thank you. I'll do it from here so that our panelists can get started right away. So as Dr. Arturo has, I apologize, Arturo, I've known you so long. So explained, this is going to be very interesting because we're going to look from the very micro level on this panel of child development, teen development. We're going to transition to talk about how do we have successful training interventions, and then we're going to talk about some of the deeper difficulties as we get into this macro market where our young people have been denied job opportunities, and looking at what that likely means that we have so many young people who have not had work experience, and how does that translate going forward. So it's going to be quite a range. We will try our best to tie it back together for you. I'm sure it will make sense at the end for you. I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves and then give a brief introduction of a few minutes to talk about their area, and then we're going to have a conversation amongst us to try and see how this all ties together, and then we'll invite questions from you. So I'm going to start off with Laurence Steinberg, who is to my right. We're going to proceed to my right. And then Professor Adriana Kugler, and then Dr. Margaret Sims from the Urban Institute. And in full disclosure, it was my great pleasure to serve as Assistant Secretary for Policy under President Obama, and I worked with Adriana when she was the chief economist there. And I don't want to make this sound incorrect because then it sounds like I'm calling her old, but Margaret is one of my mentors. So you can have peer mentors. And so she's one of my peer mentors. So Laurence is going to start us off. Again, we're going to look from this sort of micro level of the clay that we're using to talk about the skill training, and as we go across the panel here, where we will start to talk about the skill training and then the impact of the labor market. So Laurence, please.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I don't have slides. I've come to believe that power corrupts and PowerPoints corrupt absolutely. I am a developmental psychologist specializing in adolescence, and I study the relationship between adolescent brain development and adolescent psychological development. And what I'd like to do this morning is to talk a little bit about what we've discovered in recent decades about the adolescent brain and the implications of these discoveries for our education and labor force policies that affect young people in this country. We need a new way of thinking about adolescence that can be informed by this neuroscience. I think if you are the parent of a teenager and you've ever visited a bookstore in which they have books aimed at raising kids during this stage of life, what you will find on those shelves are a lot of survival guides. And actually, if you look at the titles of books aimed at parents of teenagers, you will be amazed at the number of them that have the word survive or survival in the title. There actually is a book out there, and I'm not kidding about this, called How to Survive Your Dog's Adolescence. But this apparently is a cross-species problem that we need to deal with. I think that because we have stereotyped this period as one in which the best possible outcome is to survive it, we have not spent a great deal of time thinking about how we might make it into a time when people thrive rather than simply survive. And I think that that has led at the policy level to a disproportionate investment in resources and programs designed to prevent problems rather than to facilitate positive development. And while it is important to prevent problems, and I don't mean to minimize the fact that large numbers of young people in this country do have serious problems that we ought to address as educators and policymakers and parents, that the majority of kids don't. And that what the majority of young people in this country need are educational and vocational opportunities that help them develop in positive directions. And I believe that the neuroscience of adolescence is confirming this different kind of vision and supporting it. Now we need to go from this new way of thinking about adolescence as a period in which people can really thrive to policies that take advantage of these discoveries. So the principal discovery that I want to share with you this morning is that it turns out that adolescence is a time of remarkable brain plasticity. Plasticity is the word that neuroscientists use to refer to the capacity of the brain to be influenced and shaped by experience. I know that everyone in this room is familiar with research showing that the early years, 0 to 5, let's say, comprise a time of tremendous brain plasticity, and that's why it has been important and continues to be important to invest in early childhood education and quality childcare during this age period. It's a relatively recent revelation that there is a second burst in brain plasticity that takes place during adolescence, largely as a consequence of the impact of puberty on the brain. So we typically think of puberty as something that changes our sexual function and reproductive function and external appearance, but we also now understand that puberty has some fairly remarkable effects on the way the brain develops and on the way the brain functions. And one of those effects is to make the brain more plastic, that is more malleable and more easily affected by experience. Now, this has a couple of important implications. One is that because plasticity cuts both ways, it makes adolescence both a time of vulnerability, that is when people can be easily harmed by exposure to toxic experiences, because the brain is susceptible to change at this point in time, but it also makes adolescence a time of opportunity when we can take advantage of facilitative experiences that also draw on the brain's malleability and capacity for change. Now, when the brain is plastic, as it is during early childhood and during adolescence, or especially plastic during those ages, it is not plastic in all regions of the brain or in all brain systems at the same point in time. So for example, during the early years, the brain's visual cortex, the part of the brain that regulates our ability to see, is highly plastic, and those of you who've raised children know that during the first year or year and a half of life, babies become much better at seeing things. Babies are not born with 20/20 vision, it develops over time. But you may also have noticed that kids don't become better at seeing things after they're 1.5 or 2 years old. One of the reasons for that is that that part of the brain loses its plasticity and it's no longer affected by environmental experience. Some parts of the brain are plastic longer than that. Language acquisition is a good example of that. So we know that it is much more difficult to acquire a second language after childhood, that is after puberty, than it is before. And that's because language acquisition systems of the brain become far less plastic at that point in time. So it's not impossible to learn a second language as an adult, but it's much more difficult than it is to learn it when you're a young child. So when we talk about brain plasticity during adolescence, it's important to say something about where the brain is particularly plastic during this time period. And it turns out that one of the major regions where the brain is plastic during adolescence is the prefrontal cortex. That is the part of the brain right behind your forehead. The prefrontal cortex is the brain's CEO. It is the part of the brain that's responsible for advanced thinking abilities, what psychologists often refer to as executive function. But it's also the part of the brain that's responsible for self-regulation or self-control, the ability to exercise willful control over our thoughts and our behaviors and our feelings. These two aspects of prefrontal functioning are important for understanding labor force development because clearly the kinds of jobs that we have available now and that we will certainly continue to see available in the future require advanced thinking abilities. So to the extent that the prefrontal cortex is still plastic during adolescence, this suggests that we ought to be trying to facilitate prefrontal development in our educational systems to help build the advanced thinking skills that kids will need to be successful as they continue their education and ultimately move into the labor force. My interest has not been so much on these advanced thinking skills, but on the development of self-regulation, which has been neglected, I think, in our discussion of what educational institutions ought to be emphasizing in their treatment of young people of this age. Self-regulation falls into the broader category of what many economists and psychologists call non-cognitive skills, or soft skills. Self-regulation, it turns out, is extremely predictive of success in school and in the labor force. In fact, many studies have now confirmed that self-control is a better predictor of who does well in school than IQ is. And it's a better predictor of who does well in the labor force than talent is. And so anything that we can do to help facilitate stronger self-regulation and stronger self-control in young people is going to increase their chances for success in life. Now, one other impact of puberty on the brain, in addition to making it more plastic, is that puberty and pubertal hormones arouse the brain's reward centers in ways that make individuals much more likely to go after experiences that they find exciting or potentially pleasurable. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the neurotransmitter dopamine. Dopamine is the main brain chemical that is active in pathways when we experience reward or pleasure, and it's active regardless of what the source of the pleasure is. And so when we either experience or anticipate rewarding things like food or sex or money or praise, we have an increase in dopamine activity, which is what lets us feel good from the experience or anticipation of that stimulus. Because of the impact of puberty on the brain, there is more dopamine activity in the brain's reward centers during adolescence than at any other point in human development. Now, the bad news for all of us in this room is that what that means is that nothing will ever feel as good to you for the rest of your life as it did when you were a teenager. But a more serious implication of that is that this increase in dopamine activity at puberty inclines young people to go after experiences that are often risky and reckless. And this is going on at a time when the prefrontal cortex is still developing and where the the capacity for self-regulation is still somewhat immature. And so we have likened the situation to that of a car with the accelerator pressed down to the floor before there's a very good braking system in place. And so one reason to focus on building self-control and self-regulation is to help provide kids with the tools they'll need to resist impulses to get involved in behaviors that can be harmful or even life-threatening. Now, I want to just link this theme back to some of the presentations that were made yesterday about the importance of intervening during early childhood. I don't think anyone would argue with the fact that that's critical to do. But I sometimes feel that our emphasis on early childhood as a point of intervention has distracted us from thinking about other times in the child's life when it's critical to invest resources in facilitating development. And if you look at some of the work by Jim Heckman and others, the studies that they have done on non-cognitive skills have found not only that early childhood is an important point of intervention, but that adolescence is, at least for the development of things like self-regulation, an equally important point of intervention. That happens to be buried in the footnotes and never emphasized in the headlines, but it's there if you look at the studies. And I can only say that I get nervous when we lead the public to believe that early childhood intervention is some sort of inoculation. It's not. It's an investment, but we need to continue to provide booster shots along the way, and adolescence is a critical time when we ought to be applying these booster shots. Now, we know a few things about what we can do to help facilitate stronger self-control and stronger self-regulation during adolescence. One of them is by educating parents on how to raise children according to a style that we have talked about as authoritative parenting, which is a parenting approach that combines being very warm with being very firm. There is 5 decades of research showing that children raised under such circumstances have better self-regulatory skills than kids who are raised in a permissive or an authoritarian household. A second thing that we know is that challenging young people to engage in higher order thinking abilities in school helps facilitate better self-regulation as well, because these challenges operate on the very same brain systems. And the very sad news about American higher education is that our high schools, by and large, are not very good, especially compared to high schools in other developed nations. And surveys of young people in America and in other countries bear this out. So young people who have come from other countries and studied in American high schools for part of their high school career tell us that American high schools are much easier and much more boring than high schools are in their countries. And along similar lines, American students who have spent time studying abroad during their high school years say that high schools in other countries are more challenging than they are here. So we need to do a lot to improve the quality of high school education in ways that challenges kids to reach a little bit higher. I know that the popular coverage of high school in America tends to emphasize the stress that young people are under. And while I don't want to discount that, I will say that the evidence is that most young people in this country are not stressed by challenging high schools, but are bored by high schools that don't demand very much from them. And we're not going to solve the labor force problems that we anticipate unless we can make high schools better. And let me just conclude then by saying that policy calls to increase access to higher education are fine, they're all well and good, but if the young people who are going into post-secondary institutions don't have the capacity to succeed there, it doesn't really matter if we provide the economic resources for young people to pursue their educations beyond that. So we really need to take advantage of what we're learning from neuroscience, teach parents how to be better parents of teenagers, and get schools to become more challenging for young people, both for the development of the higher order thinking abilities that they'll need to be successful, but also for the development of soft skills that we now know are critical for labor market success. Thanks.
So I actually have have a PowerPoint presentation. There we go. So thank you so much, Larry, for those remarks. Mine build up on some of the things that Larry talked about. I will be talking about providing skills development to adolescents and youth who are faced with problematic situations, and talk about the implications of that for increasing labor market success. So I'm going to build up on what Larry talked about, and interestingly, a lot of the programs that I will be talking about do have this aspect of providing life skills, soft skills along the way, and along with cognitive training. So let me start by giving a little bit of background. So as you know, the unemployment rate has fallen drastically from a high of 10% during the Great Recession to now about close to 4.5%. But at the same time, we know that the unemployment rate remains just too high for too many. So in particular, if you look at adolescents and 16 to 19-year-olds, the unemployment rate remains in double digits, above 14%. Also for minorities, the unemployment rate remains extremely high. So the unemployment rate for African Americans is twice as high as the unemployment rate for whites. The unemployment rate for Latinos is 1.5 percentage points higher than for whites. And this is extremely worrisome because this is a permanent situation, whether it is during a recession or during a recovery like what we've been facing over the past few years. So one way to help these groups of workers to improve their success in the labor market is to offer educational attainment. We do know, in fact, that education matters in terms of increasing success in the labor market. The unemployment rate is a lot higher for those who drop out of high school, and earnings are a lot lower for those who drop out of high school. So if you look at this data, you see that the unemployment rate for those who drop out of high school is twice as high as for those with an associate degree. It is almost 4 times as high as for those who get a graduate degree. Likewise, earnings are less than half for those who drop out of high school compared to those with a bachelor's degree, and it is less than a third for those who drop out compared to those with a graduate degree. So educational attainment is part of the story. So just getting access to formal schooling, getting through formal schooling is part of the story. But as Larry mentioned, it also matters what content people get during those school years. So it's not only getting through school, but what skills I'll learn while in school as well, and during the lifetime experience of people as well. So as Larry mentioned, there is a lack of adequate skills as far as we know, as far as the data tells us, not only in terms of getting through schooling sometimes and learning basic numeracy, literacy skills as well, but also in terms of catching on to non-cognitive skills. And this includes 2 aspects. One is getting the technical skills that are needed in a specific occupations, in a specific trades, getting manual dexterity, things that are needed in many occupations. But something that has largely been ignored by economists and that now we're learning from psychologists is that it has become more and more important to also learn soft or social-emotional skills. And this includes behavioral skills that are caught on, including self-regulation, emotional stability, self-discipline, things that are very critical in the labor market as well, and that are valued by employers. And many of these are not necessarily taught in a school, but as I'm gonna show you, some of the training programs that have been proposed in recent years actually tend to focus on providing these life skills or social-emotional skills that sometimes people get at home, but oftentimes people don't. So let me show you a little bit of data from the PIAC, the Program on International Assessment of Adult Competencies. And this PIAC actually measures proficiency in numeracy and literacy, but also in problem solving, which is one of these kind of soft skills that are very crucial. And what this data shows you the level of proficiency. So the darker the color, the lower the proficiency. And there are different levels from 1 to 5. And it shows you the level of proficiency. The top one is the numeracy scale. The second one is the literacy scale. And the last one gives you the level of proficiency in problem solving. So what this shows you is basically that people who are unemployed have many more deficiencies and have lower levels of proficiency in terms of numeracy skills, in terms of literacy skills, and also, very importantly, in terms of these problem-solving skills. And if we look at data by race and ethnicity, we see a little bit of the same picture. We see that Latinos and African Americans tend to have lower levels of proficiency in terms of numeracy and literacy. Of course, these may be in part because of the quality of the schools and the quality of education that many minority kids are getting. But they also tend to have this lower level of proficiency in terms of problem solving. So these are certainly issues to be addressed. It's not only about finishing high school and getting people to graduate from high school, but to provide these additional skills, to provide the right cognitive skills that are needed, numeracy and literacy, but also to provide the soft skills, including problem solving, but also others that are necessary in the labor market. So who's seen the most need of these skills? So as Larry mentioned, adolescence is a critical time when people still respond and have the plasticity to actually absorb and learn many of these skills. So a lot of these programs have focused on youth who are still in school but who are at risk of dropping out or who may be engaging in problematic behaviors. The second group that has been a target of many of these programs, training programs that try to address deficiencies in skills, are people who have already dropped out of the formal education system. So you need to give people second chances, right? It's not enough to provide early childhood education. People actually are still part of our society, potentially productive members of our society who should be given that second chance. And even adults without jobs seem to still benefit, although the plasticity for us is a lot lower, right? There is still some evidence by psychologists that you can still learn some of these social emotional skills as well, even later in life. So let me talk about some of these programs. In particular, I want to talk about the programs targeted towards at-risk youth who are still in school. So what these programs aim to do is to, first of all, improve school performance, to reduce the chances that these kids will drop out, to encourage them to increase post-secondary education, and very importantly, to increase this post-school employment and earnings as well. So some of the best programs that we know about and the ones that have been evaluated rigorously with randomized assignment, where you basically assign one group to the program and leave another group out, but you do this at random, so you know that what we're capturing is actually the effect of the program, include career academies, quantum opportunities, and opening doors. The first one focuses career academies, a program that focuses mainly on improving the chances at doing well in the labor market and doing well later in terms of post-school employment and earnings. The latter two, quantum opportunities and opening doors, have focused much more on keeping kids in school and also getting them to attain post-secondary schooling. So some of the key components, they vary a little bit, these programs, but they share some common components. They include learning communities with very personalized learning. So in a large high school, they group kids into smaller communities where they have much more personalized attention. They supplement classroom education with summer employment opportunities or year-round opportunities. And the curriculum is much more closely connected to work and skills, and they create partnerships with employers in the areas. So all those are very key components of these different programs. Now here kind of graphically some of the effects that are found of these programs, which are rigorously evaluated. So the first one, we see a big impact in terms of career academies, in terms of employment. In the other two programs, we see that opening doors had a big impact in terms of post-secondary education. So they do seem to be effective, and I think there is some hope that these programs can help not only keep kids in school, but also help them later in life in terms of post-secondary education as well as employment. For out-of-school youth, the focus has been much more on remedial training, remedial education, because people never finish high school, so you need to help them with those some basic numeracy and literacy skills and overcome deficiencies that some of these kids have in terms of cognitive and non-cognitive skills. They also include this other component, just like the programs I just described, in terms of being more work-oriented, providing much more vocational and on-the-job training. So here we have some of the programs that Arturo has evaluated himself, including Job Corps, which is a residential program, as well as non-residential programs such as the Center for Employment Training. And here too, the key components are they're very individualized, they tackle basic skills, they are competency-based, and they're very, very focused on teaching specific traits, specific occupations, and being very closely linked to employers and to labor organizations as well. So here the impacts are also promising. Job Corps has high returns. It's also a very costly program, but it does have very high returns. And the Center for Employment Training shows very promising effects, especially in high fidelity sites, such as the ones in California. There's also a set of programs from other countries from which I think we can learn that have been tremendously effective and tackle some of the same issues. These are youth programs aimed at disadvantaged youth, also pretty much high school dropouts in Latin America, in Colombia, in Peru, in the Dominican Republic, which include classroom training as well as on-the-job training. They teach life skills. They have this important component of teaching life skills, and it has a pay-for-performance component that links the training to demand and to employers as well. So here the effects are actually very promising. They have shown very large effects, both in terms of earnings and employment, in particularly for women. So this is my work in Colombia. There is some work in Peru as well that shows that if you provide, again, high-quality training, then you tend to have very high returns, both in terms of employment and in terms of earnings. Now, when you come to talk about adults, some of the most promising programs that we've seen in the US are programs that are known as sectoral training. They, again, link very closely to different sectors of the economy, and we have some rigorous evaluations that have been done of some smaller programs in specific cities, in specific areas, including the Wisconsin Regional Training Partnership, which partner with construction and manufacturing sectors, the Perescuelas program in New York and Miami, which partner with the IT sector, and the Jewish Vocational Service in Boston, which also partner in this case with the health sector. So some key elements of all these programs are that they have partnered with the specific industries and with employer organizations. They have also provided individualized services and job readiness skills or soft skills, so they have very much that focus as well, even for people who are already adults, and they provide a screening for employers. And here the impacts are also promising, in particular the Wisconsin Training Partnership as well as the Jewish Vocational Service in Boston have shown to have large impacts in terms of particular earnings, but also of employment and the quality of employment, which is very important as well. So let me just now conclude. I think there is some common thread that we see here in terms of what makes these programs that I've talked about very successful. They tackle both cognitive as well as non-cognitive skills, so many of them tend to provide this remedial education in terms of numeracy and literacy, but they also very importantly tackle these soft skills and life skills, as they call them in some cases, which are provided to youth, both in a school when they're out of school, and even to adults. So this has been a very crucial component that you see in all of these programs that I just showed you, which have been rigorously evaluated and show a very high return. So generally, just to conclude, let me say that these skills development that works best, as far as we can tell from all of these programs that I just mentioned, include close links to employers, close links to the work environment. It includes this very important component of soft skills development. And very importantly as well, I think something to consider is that a lot of these programs provide wraparound services. They provide transportation subsidies, sometimes childcare subsidies. They provide that extra help that many of these troubled youths may need along the way in order to be able to succeed in these programs and to be able to take advantage and increase their potential in the labor market. Thank you.
Good morning. I am, I guess, midway between the two previous speakers in that I have a few slides that cover part of what I'm going to say, and then I have no slides for the rest. So I think throughout the conference we've heard about the importance of early work for transitions to adulthood, beginning, I believe, with the Federal Reserve Board Chair, Janet Yellen, talking about it yesterday morning, and it's recurred in many of the talks that we've had. If we think about long-term trends in youth employment, and here I'm covering 16 to 24, not just the teenage years, that there's been some decline in labor force participation among teens due to longer periods of employment. However, if we look at the chart, we show employment, here I'm showing employment to population ratios, which adjust for labor force participation efforts. That is, it kind of adjusts for people who may not be looking for work because they may not think it's available or for other reasons. And we see three things here. One is the sort of summer youth spikes that come with people who, youth who work when they're not in school. We also see some changes in labor force participation over the business cycle, but I think the most persistent trend or pattern that we see is the difference by race and ethnicity with unemployment or labor force participation rates, employment to population ratios for African Americans and Hispanic youth being below those of their white counterparts. Now, for 20 to 24-year-olds, for 20 to 24-year-olds, the differentials partially reflect the longer time it takes for young people of color to establish a firm footing in the labor market. For example, work by two of my colleagues, Marla McDaniel and Daniel Kuhn, using the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, show that even after adjusting for a number of youth characteristics that we might associate with aptitude, experience, background, high school completion, and so on, there are still gaps in the length of time it takes African American youth to become established in the job market. African American high school graduates take twice as long as white high school graduates to attain steady full-time employment. And in fact, it takes them longer than it does for white high school dropouts. So that, for example, by age 22, they have just begun to catch up with dropouts. And it takes longer for them to have steady employment compared to white high school graduates. These are results similar to results that were reported yesterday by Alicia Labert in one of the breakout sessions. But there are youth who, there are youth who do go to work and go to work early. In 2 studies conducted by my colleagues Molly Scott and Sierra Lantham, the short and longer term impact of dropping out to go to work is examined. About 30% of early school leavers actually work. We think of dropouts as being disconnected, neither in school nor working, but in fact, a substantial part of them do work. And they are disproportionately male and Hispanic. And looking at their contributions to household income, we see that they're actually fairly substantial in many cases. These are low-income families, households, and in some cases, as much as a quarter of the household incomes come from the work of these young people. But this early work does not help them advance in the long run. So early labor force attachment in this case does not help. In their second study, Scott and Lantham find that while, I did it again, sorry. There are 2 green buttons and I keep hitting the wrong one. That in fact, their likelihood of working is better than dropouts who did not work, but fall behind their counterparts who finished high school, whether they worked early in their teenage years or not. And they were, while they're less likely to work, they also consequently have lower earnings. Now, what 2 of the studies that I talked about show is that education does matter because given your race or ethnicity, more education improves your labor market outcomes, but it doesn't result in equality. And I'd like to talk, while one of the other speakers talked about the importance of improving the skills of young people, that is, particularly those who drop out, but perhaps those whose high school experiences did not provide them with all of the education and skills that they needed. I wanted to talk instead about structural barriers and workplace problems that increase the chances or reduce the chances that young people will be successful. So when I talk about structural change in the economy, I'm not talking about the kind that we usually think of as the economy moves from a manufacturing society to more of a service and technology-based economy. I'm talking about the structures that tend to shut youth of color out of the job market. And some of these were alluded to in one of the other sessions yesterday. I think in Bill Edmonds talked primarily, he was talking about wealth differences. Here I'm talking about employment differences. So some of these we looked at in a study that I did with 2 of my colleagues for Pittsburgh, which looked at structural barriers to employment. And I would say that one of them that we tend to talk about is the whole question of soft skills. But soft skills are not just, you might say, employee-specific, that in fact, soft skills are contextual. That is, the kinds of skills that you need depend upon the context in which you find yourselves. But what we tend not to think of when we talk about it is to put soft skills burden all on the employee, when in fact, as workplaces become more diverse, there is also a burden on the employer and the supervisor to become culturally competent. In some of the work that I did with the Casey Foundation around their jobs initiative some years ago, they had looked at this issue of soft skills. Now, if we can just include soft skills in our training programs, then we will have solved the problem when we move the young people into the workplace. And in fact, after doing this for about a year, we had worked on them and what are soft skills, who's doing it, where can you learn about how to do soft skills. And so they did that, and then they came back and they said, well, you know, the kids are learning the soft skills, but the workplace isn't working for them. And they gave one example, which is kind of an extreme and you might think an unusual example, but one of their sites was in Colorado, and they said, well, the employer had decided to diversify his workforce, and so he started hiring non-Hispanic youth, but the workplace was all based on speaking Spanish, which meant that he was making a concession by changing the composition of his labor force, but he's not changing the way his workplace operated to make sure that these individuals could be successful. In some of the work that I did in Pittsburgh, we looked at a number of barriers that operated based in part on structural racism. That is, systems that are in place that don't necessarily appear to be racially or ethnically biased, but in fact have the end result. So some of it flows from things like physical barriers that keep people from getting to jobs. Either they're in isolated communities that are the result of housing segregation, they have poor public transportation systems and no automobiles because they don't have enough income to really buy and operate an automobile. And then compound that with the fact that in many communities, you get your jobs through networks. Networks function to tell you about where job opportunities are. They connect you to people who know about the employers and who can vouch for you when you show up to apply for the job. These are also very segregated and tend to be very segregated in most communities. Then there are the questions about the training. When we talk about the training programs, then there are a number of training programs that are publicly supported or publicly subsidized, but as was discussed yesterday in one of the sessions, there are also private, for-profit, and sometimes nonprofit training programs that involve either you paying for it or you sacrifice income that you could make in part-time employment in order to participate in training opportunities that will improve your labor market outlook. There are also a set of employer biases, often implicit biases, that work against young people, and that is the presumption that when they take the information from a chart like the one that we saw that had the frequency of acquiring skills, and employers attribute to individuals what they see on the chart rather than looking at the individual skills. And then I'll just mention 2 or 3 things that are regulatory, which can work in a couple of ways. One is the ban the box issue, that is the box where you have to check whether you've ever been convicted of a felony. And right now there's a little bit of controversy in the research about whether ban the box increases or decreases employment opportunities for African American males in particular, because of employers' assumptions that if they don't have the information about whether they have been convicted of a felony, they just assign a statistical probability. The other thing has to do with regulations, state regulations or local regulations, and in some cases, Federal Reserve regulations that prevent people from being employed in certain positions for reasons of financial risk or criminal liability should something happen to patients, for example, in hospitals, which is one big example. But then there are other professions where it has nothing to do with the workplace, but the regulations or the laws still exist. And then I would just like to mention a couple of other things, and we can discuss more in the discussion period, which has to do with employer-specific approaches to hiring. One of them has to do with online job applications. I've heard some people say, oh, well, you know, today, in today's world, you don't have to worry about it because everybody has a cell phone and therefore they're online, they're connected. And the response is, have you ever tried to fill out a job application on a cell phone? Well, I think your experience would suggest that you might not successfully get through it in a way that would make you a good candidate for a job. I'll just end there, and we can move into the discussion period. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I think, as I mentioned, we just ran the gamut of a broad range of barriers and skill acquisition challenges. I guess I'll start with you, Margaret, since you went last. We'll work our way this way. One of the things in the African American community we celebrated last month, that President Obama gets to claim he can claim February too, but the January employment report was that finally, if you were Black and had an associate's degree, you finally had an unemployment rate lower than a white high school dropout. And in fact, you were almost close to being considered like a white high school graduate, that you finally had an unemployment rate that was about the same. And so the within disparity, the disparity within skill level is so large that sometimes we forget, as you mentioned, that while skill holds within race, that the within skill differences, though, are so high that it's very hard, if not impossible, to close racial wealth gaps only through skill because of those within skill gaps. And one of the more subtle differences you highlighted, I thought, had to do with this perception of these soft skills. Disproportionately, we see young African Americans actually in jobs that are still personal services or personal services like. Whether it's in healthcare or whether it's in retail, they tend to be the person who deals with the person, not necessarily the technician. So help us in understanding this, because when you look at the actual job market, it looks like the comparative advantage for Black youth actually are in these personal spaces. But our perception often is that that's a skill gap. It doesn't line up with the data.
Well, I think one of the things that we need to think about in it is the range of soft skills. That soft skills covers a gamut of activities, so that some of the ones that we think about in terms of frontline service are fairly basic soft skills. Though, you know, from showing up consistently and on time for work, greeting customers and in a pleasant manner, delivering things on a timely basis. But then there's a set of soft skills which may or may not be present, but people sometimes make assumptions about, which have to do with problem solving, decision making, some of the higher level skills when we get back to some of the issues of brain development and how people deal with difficult situations. And I think that those are areas where it's more ambiguous, and those can definitely be a factor when you get the job, but you don't get the promotion.
Yeah, I marvel at a very practical application of problem solving we just had in November. And overwhelmingly, Black voters seem to have seen through a certain person who claimed all sorts of things that he could never substantiate. They didn't vote for him. white voters seem to have voted for him. So in this sort of typical real world problem solving, I marvel that people think that black people still lack problem solving skills. That was a big test. I think some people failed. Laurence, help us, because often, we do think about the teenage years as problematic for us adults. But as you mentioned, it is a time for refining and improving the soft skills of future workers. How does that line up with what we do in schools, which seem to be very heavily emphasized on cognitive skills? And to what extent, when we emphasize a very personal reward, because a high stakes test, it's I pass, I don't care about you. How does that help, that environment help? And then what kind of signals does it send, and what kind of messages does it send? And what space does it leave for educators to handle these other skills?
Well, first, I think that there's a false dichotomy between what we call cognitive and what we call non-cognitive skills. And that false dichotomy, I think, is getting in the way of doing what we ought to do in our schools, because when individuals like myself try to persuade schools that part of their job is to foster non-cognitive skills, their immediate response is, we don't have time to do that because they're too involved in testing or the demands of a required curriculum or something like that. I think the research suggests that it's the way that you teach the subject areas that are supposed to lead to cognitive skills that facilitates non-cognitive skills, and not whether you teach them or not. So for example, let's say that cooperation and interpersonal competence is something that we want to facilitate. Well, you can help develop that through teaching history or literature or science or what have you, by emphasizing group projects or collaborative projects or things like that. So there's a possibility to help stimulate the growth of this important non-cognitive skill through the teaching of a conventional subject area. So it's really how we go about teaching those conventional subjects, not how much time we spend on them relative to the other ones. And the evaluations of programs designed to teach socio-emotional learning or non-cognitive skills, I think, show quite clearly that they need to be integrated into the regular curriculum, not put in as an add-on to do that. So I think that's what we need to think about. May I make just a little plug here that the Aspen Institute has recently launched a commission on socio-emotional academic development. And I encourage those of you interested in this to go to the Aspen Institute's website, because they're going to be coming out with some very strong statements about the need for America to emphasize this aspect of young people's development more than we presently do.
So, Adriana, you pointed out we finally got the Great Recession to chase down the unemployment rate. One big challenge we always have with training is, what do we do when the unemployment rate is high? And one of the slides that Margaret had highlighted one of those difficulties, that if you look at the results of young people who work versus those who didn't work, we get this huge boost among those who had the opportunity to work. How do we meet these challenges of very loose labor markets? Because it seems like on-the-job experience still matters. How do we handle that? What are the ways we need to think about training programs when we have very loose labor markets and we can't get that on-the-job experience that young people used to get?
So I think a lot of these programs have been introduced precisely during downturns, right? During recessions, when you really need them. And I think one issue to think about is who actually suffers the most during these recessions. It's usually minorities, it's usually disadvantaged groups already. So they already have that difference that Margaret showed, that I showed, but during recessions that even magnifies. It means you're swimming upstream, right? You now are competing not only against the group that you usually compete with for jobs, but you're competing against those other people who have even much higher education levels. And so you almost have to compensate, right? Because you face all those other hurdles, right? Of not having networks, of statistical discrimination, all those other things. And so getting even more education becomes all the more important. But I think what was very crucial about many of the programs that I talked about is that they do have this on-the-job component and this very, very strong link with employers. And they actually, all of these programs, including the sectoral training programs, but also the programs I talk about in Latin America with the pay for performance component, and also even the career academies, they have very close links with labor organizations and with employers, and they target the jobs that are actually available at the time. So it actually offers a chance for people to get a foot in the door, which they would maybe not have because they don't have the right networks or because they're last in the queue. And so this actually allows them to move up in the queue to access those jobs that they would otherwise not have.
And one of the more famous sectoral training programs happen to be those offered by unions, whether we look at the machinists and their relationship with the aerospace industry, or whether we look at building trades and their relationship. We have a very declined membership. What does that say as a way of access for young people to a very well-funded, coordinated relationship between employers and workers when we have declining access to those types of opportunities?
So yeah, the Wisconsin Training Partnership is a very good case at hand that actually involved a very strong relationship with the unions in Wisconsin, and that actually allowed workers to access those jobs they would otherwise not have. So it is very unfortunate because then, right, you don't have the voice, you don't have that presence in the workplace that allows employers to, and labor organizations in this case, to be the link between employers and those out there in the regional markets.
Yeah, so Margaret, your chart on not working or working in the teenage years, which was so typical for American teenagers up through 2000. Since 2000, this has become less the case, and now it's the minority of students who actually get this kind of experience. What are the ways we can tighten our labor market to get young people back in? One of the very interesting things in your chart was the closing of the gap in this century between the employment to population ratio for black youngsters and white youngsters. Unfortunately, a lot of that was because of a downward drift for white youngsters, though during the recovery, your chart did show that the African American employment to population ratio was rising under President Obama. So part of the conversion is the rising level for African Americans under 24. But what can we do to try and get labor markets to stay tight so that we can continue to see that progress?
Well, I think some of that is clearly macro policy, but we should also think about other ways in which we can provide labor market experience for young people, even in situations where there's not completely full employment. So if you look at some of the sort of school to work, career academy opportunities that provide people with the work experience, even when there may not be a really tight labor market, it's something we have to think about, how you put together a combination of general labor market and economic conditions to make the market tight, and ways in which, regardless of the state of the labor market, you can provide experiences for young people that will be valued in the labor market at the time when they can go out full time.
I'll give you the last one so we can open it up and have people here ask some questions and participate as well. So, Laurence, you talked about making sure that we had some authority within young people. When schools try and do that as a way of improving soft skills, we see huge disparities in who gets suspended. We see huge disparities between the race of the teacher and the race of the students and who gets suspended. Part of the gap in skill acquisition that we know we can document goes to how many days you've been suspended. So how do we get this so that we have self-control, which you point out is an important soft skill that needs to be learned as an adolescent, but how do we do that in a way that is more culturally appropriate so that we don't see these kind of disparities?
Well, I have two responses, if you'll indulge me. The first is that we need to stop criminalizing what is normative behavior during this age period. When I misbehaved in school, and I did, I was sent to the assistant principal's office. I wasn't sent to the cops. And to the extent that we keep shunting kids, particularly kids of color, into the justice system, we're interfering with their educational development and therefore with their vocational development. We didn't have time, many things we could have spoken about this morning, but clearly the over-incarceration of children of color, of people of color, needs to be discussed in the context of what we're talking about today, because obviously the incarceration of a young person during these critical years, let's say 16 to 24, is going to interfere with that person's educational development. But what also needs to be stated is that the incarceration of a young person's parent is also going to interfere with that person's educational development, because we know how important the family is for kids' success in school. So I hope that we will have some time to talk about the relationship between the education system and the justice system, because I believe that there are data that bear this out, that a significant part of inequality in labor force participation and in income is due to inequality or inequity in treatment within the justice system.
So I only get one question from the audience? I see. Okay. Well, I was going to let it go to Q&A, because if I only have 1 minute, I don't want to cheat them out of a short answer. So there's a mic here, a mic here, a mic there, and a mic there. Yes.
Hi, my name is Ann Yeoman, and I've worked in various aspects of, I guess, youth development, mostly around asset building. But I'm very aware of a good deal of the literature on social emotional development and its importance, and I think we're beginning to call that essential skills. And so my question is, since many of the at-risk youth and or youth who are already out of school, not in the labor force, opportunity youth, whatever term you want to use, are also parents, is there any actual research on these programs that attempt to develop social emotional skills along with vocational and other skills? Is there any research on how that may spill over into their parenting or into their interactions with their children?
Yeah. So, Margaret, you wanted to start answering?
I was going to say there, we did look at a program in New York City that involved young fathers, and it engaged them in a program that provided some developmental parenting skills. It was primarily focused on getting their GED, but also some job placement. And generally, it was a qualitative study, so it doesn't have it's kind of squishy in terms of data, but it did seem to both improve their attachments with their children, as well as it had a relatively high GED success ratio, which put them on a path both to be better parents and to be better providers.
And yeah, there is a little bit of evidence. Not too many of these studies kind of follow people, long enough after they do their training into adulthood, but a few do. And there is some evidence about reductions in teenage fertility, so teenage pregnancies, and also increased family attachment, so lower chances of divorce and things like that. So there is a little bit of kind of evidence of more stability in the households as adults when people grow up.
Yeah, so I mean, this is one of the problem areas when it comes to continued skill acquisition. We have so many barriers if you're a single parent and furthering your education. Fortunately, the Institute for Women's Policy Research is beginning to look at that a little closer. But if you just think about access to higher ed beyond just community college, the way we structure how many years you can get a Pell Grant, when you can get a Pell Grant, if you just think through the issues of being a single parent, you'll quickly see why these barriers suddenly come up pretty high if the parent wants to get more skill acquisition as well. Yes.
Good morning. My name's Lupe Mares, Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, El Paso branch. Adriana, I think this question is for you. Co-op programs. And I may be aging myself, and I don't know if you've ever looked into this, but where students, juniors and seniors in high school would go to school half a day, and then the second half of their day they would go out and work. They would be placed with employers. Is this something that you have researched? Because I think that is a great opportunity. I know at the El Paso branch, for example, we've hired some of those students, and they've gone on to become very successful. They made the Federal Reserve a career, and it started all with the co-op program. Have you done any research on that? And it's something that I think is very much needed.
So I have done, the closest is these programs that offer the classroom training together with the on-the-job training, which have been very successful. And they're successful for two reasons, I think. One is they offer kind of those basic skills that are sometimes lacking, but they offer a foot in the door, right? In the door of those really good jobs for people who would otherwise not have access to those jobs. And at the same time, they allow to pick up those soft skills along the way, which are not only picked up in the classroom, there's a lot of learning by doing, things that you learn by interacting with people and on the job. So I think there's some evidence of that, and I think the career academies try to simulate that, some of them more than others, right? Some of them have just the summer opportunities, but some of the very successful career academies are the ones that have the year-round employment opportunities, which kind of simulate that environment without totally taking people out of the school.
So we have folks lined up on the mics in the back. So can we take this question here?
Sure, thank you. So I was hoping that we could come back a little bit to this issue of cultural competence in relation to soft skills. I absolutely agree that soft skills are essential, and I think that there's something really fundamental there about capturing this moment in brain development. But I also worry that sometimes when we talk about it, we really put a deficit model on kids of color in particular who we talk about as not having these skills when maybe they actually have sort of a different set of skills that we need to leverage differently, or we also need to be working with employers to sort of perceive the skills that these kids bring in differently. So I'm wondering if any of the programs that you guys have researched have sort of taken a culturally competent approach, or have tackled that as sort of head on as one piece of it in their work.
And so Margaret, do you want to answer? Because you had talked about some employers who...
I think in the Jobs Initiative, they did introduce cultural competence in some sort of employer guides. We developed when I was at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, we developed some guides for frontline supervisors and employers in terms of how to make their workplace more welcoming to diverse populations and how to help those young people mostly, but not all young people, develop on the job so that they could, rather than waiting to the end of the year to say you just didn't make it, how you do the check-ins and how you work to improve their performance along the way, and also improve the the supervisor's performance in terms of interacting with a different workforce.
Yeah, I appreciate the question because I always marvel. It strikes me as an odd deficit to associate with people of color, given that for 400 years we could only do personal services. It seems kind of strange to suddenly say you don't master that. I might find it more credible to say you don't have leadership skills. It's kind of hard to argue that you don't have the skills to do the soft stuff.
Hello, my name is Adam Steinberg. I'm the Mellon ACLS Public Fellow at Reinvestment Fund, a CDFI in Philadelphia, and I have a question for Professor Steinberg. Professor, what role, if any, do you see for religious organizations, such as, say, churches, in helping adolescents develop self-control?
Well,
Go ahead.
was it for me?
Well, I think, yeah.
I think
Go ahead.
so. It was directed toward you,
Yeah.
I think.
I mean, I don't think that any institutional segment of society, has a lock on this and is necessarily the main or most important contributor to this development. So if we're talking about something like self-regulation as a generic soft skill, this is important for kids to be encouraged to develop, whether they're at home or whether they're at school or whether they're in extracurricular activities or whether they're in religious institutions or community institutions or whatever. And this is not something that can only be encouraged in one of those types of settings. It can be encouraged in all of them. I think we all have a role to play in making sure that young people are adequately prepared to be successful in the world of work.
Great. So my name is Charlene Van Dyke. I'm with the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, but this question is definitely my own and does not represent the Board of Governors or the Federal Reserve System. And it's actually related to my colleague's question about sort of how do we teach self-regulation. There was just an article in the Washington Post a few weeks ago about the Coleman School in Baltimore, West Baltimore, and how they have used meditation instead of punishment in the school. And I wanted to ask you, Dr. Steinberg, about sort of how that could work, any studies around that, especially given the importance of health and stress and everything that was discussed yesterday, and perhaps even the return on investment on something that can be done anywhere, at home, at school, and basically for free.
Yeah, there's no question that mindfulness training has been shown to facilitate the development of self-control as well as to facilitate prefrontal cortical development. Meditation is one of several routes to mindfulness, but there are schools around the country that have been introducing this into their daily curricula. It's also been done with kids of younger ages, and it's also been done in other kinds of institutions, such as those for kids that have been in trouble with the law, to great success.
My name is Tom Kegelman. I work in a nonprofit developing housing in Massachusetts, and for 40 years I've been trying to improve the life chances of many people in disadvantaged communities. And I have a comment more about the general tenor of the program than perhaps this particular issue, but I was struck yesterday in the graphics on the Milwaukee region and the segregation that was so obviously shown that, in my experience, trying to develop affordable housing in different communities, that it's not just random market forces that are putting people in different places, that these are very active, very well organized, very systematic efforts to exclude certain peoples from living in certain areas and having certain advantages to the benefit of another class, primarily white and privileged. And I want to applaud the Fed for talking so much about inequity and disparate outcomes of many of our policies. And I just wanted to make sure that we don't forget that as much as we want to improve the chances, the skills, the development of underprivileged groups, that we also look at the activities of those who are privileged and how much they are actively preventing this from going forward.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. And Margaret, this was something that you highlighted in your comments. There are structural racist barriers that create these disparities that we see. And as you mentioned, some are easy to see and some end up being more subtle. Did you want to expand?
No, I think a number of the sessions here have addressed the issue of residential segregation. I don't know that I need to expand on it, but clearly it operates in many of the dimensions that we're concerned about. It affects educational opportunities for young people, as well as the question of job access for both youth and for prime age adults. Getting to new jobs is a hard thing when the jobs move even further away from your community and further away from you in terms of the kind of networks and connections that you have to employment.
Yeah, so we're getting close to needing to wrap up. So can we take these two questions together, and we'll try and answer them quickly, and then take these two questions together and then try and answer them quickly.
Hi, my name is Kylene Hashem. I work at HUD, but again, my question is my own question and does not represent HUD. My question is for Margaret. You started to talk about some of the ways that workplaces and employers can start to take on some of the burden of being more accepting of a diverse workforce. And I think in that diversity, not only racial diversity, but those who are lower income and may come with a different set of norms and expectations as well. So in our program, we have a self-sufficiency component, and we are finding that with some of our employers, the people that we are finding jobs and placing in jobs are being fired for minor policy infractions. You know, an example is a few women who were working at a deli, and at the end of the day, they need to throw away a lot of the meat, and instead of throwing it away, they kept it because they thought it was a waste of food. And so they were fired for that action. So I'm just wondering, beyond a interaction between supervisors and employers, if there are different ways for employers to look at their own rigid zero tolerance policies that play into that as well.
Good morning, I'm Matt Calvert. I'm a youth development specialist with the University of Wisconsin Extension. And building on Professor Steinberg's call for us to provide challenging environments for young people, and thinking about, in addition to the programs that you've featured, which really I think are about pipelining and connecting young people to the workforce with good results, I want to think about other ways that young people become connected to workforce and in more flexible and perhaps more youth-centered ways. I think I guess I would like the speakers to think about whether in our current job market, which isn't so much about lifetime employment, but more about gig economy, flexibility, innovation, et cetera, there are other pathways that we might consider for young people, whether it's connecting via arts or civic activism or other places where young people can get connected to relationships, skills, and participate in challenging environments. So thinking about other options to connecting young people to civil society, work, et cetera, that are perhaps more youth development centered and less employer centered.
Did you want to take the first question?
Yeah, I would use that example. I can see that there would be multiple issues here, not that an employer could work through. So, for example, if what their rule or regulation is based on city food inspector codes that say that the meat has to be disposed of, is there a way, for example, of having a waiver that the employee would sign that they wouldn't be holding the employer liable should the meat be tainted, for example? I mean, you know, then there's also perhaps, you know, in some jurisdictions there are ways in which employers can, or vendors can give their food at the end of the day to shelters or other locations for, you know, as donations. Is there a way of building that into having employees take it away? So there's, you know, there may be on the surface not just a, you know, it appears that the employer is just wasting food and being petty by not letting the employee take it home. But there are ways that you could work with the employer to try to find out what are the parameters, what are the regulations that they themselves might be put into, and how do you work around those in a way that both the employer is operating the way they have to for food inspection, but the employee is not necessarily harmed by it, or if there's no way around it, that the employee understands why there is a regulation that doesn't allow them to take the food home. So, you know, it's a question of going back and looking at the way you operate your business and how do you accommodate what are clearly different perspectives on how things should be disposed of.
So Adriana, you looked at job training programs, but was mentioned, the question seemed to suggest that are there other programs we know that engage young people, whether it's sports or music, where we know that they learn teamwork, self-discipline, those sorts of things that we know how positive.
Yeah, there are actually some very interesting studies of precisely music and sports programs that engage students to develop these skills, and that combine, actually, there was a very interesting program in Boston that combined the schoolwork together with the sports and kind of being able to balance out, but learning from the skills, as you said, integrating some of the skills, the soft skills within the sports and within the academic work as well. So those are after-school programs that tend to work very effectively.
Yes, and which unfortunately are programs we tend to cut, isn't that right?
Exactly, but just to expand on that a little bit, one of the extra advantages of getting kids engaged in those kinds of programs is that it tends to strengthen their bond to the school, which then improves their academic performance. And another example of a program like that that can be helpful would be community service activities. Structured community service activities, particularly if they have a component that ties back into school, can also help build these non-cognitive skills.